The United States and Iran have announced a 2-week ceasefire brokered by Pakistan, under which Iran has agreed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, the vital waterway of oil and natural gas shipments. The deal was reached Tuesday evening, less than 2 hours before President Trump's deadline for Iran to reopen the strait, under threat of destroying every power plant and major bridge in the country. Trump announced the deal on social media, calling it a, quote, double-sided ceasefire, and saying Iran had put forward a, quote, workable 10-point peace plan. Iran's Supreme National Security Council said it accepted the terms, but warned that its, quote, hands remain on the trigger. Soon after the announcement, Iran State TV said the United States had, quote, suffered an undeniable, historic and crushing defeat. This morning, Trump posted that the United States will be working closely with Iran to discuss sanctions and tariff relief, and said there would be no uranium enrichment. Israel has said it backs the ceasefire deal between the United States and Iran, but added that the ceasefire does not include Lebanon, contradicting an earlier statement from Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif of Pakistan. Meanwhile, in Iran, crowds of people gathered in Tehran and other Iranian cities, waving flags to celebrate the news. This is a resident of Tehran earlier this morning.
I heard this morning that our conditions had been accepted, and then a ceasefire was declared. I was genuinely happy from the bottom of my heart. Hopefully this can open a path to victory, lead to the lifting of unjust sanctions, and allow Iranians, after all these years, to live like others and simply breathe.
The 11th hour ceasefire announcement followed a tense day that began with Trump's issuing an expansive threat that if Iran did not reopen the Strait of Hormuz by his deadline of 8 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday, quote, a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. I don't want that to happen, but it probably will, he said. Condemnations poured in from across the world, describing Trump's threat as unacceptable and that any such attacks would be war crimes. Here in the United States, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez described Trump's ultimatum as a, quote, threat of genocide that merits removal from office. Over 24 Democrats, as well as several prominent conservatives, including former Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, also called for President Trump's removal under the 25th Amendment. For more on all this, we're joined now by two guests. Sadeghi Bouroujerdi is an assistant professor in the International Relations of the Middle East at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. He's the author of Revolution and Its Discontents, Political Thought and Reform in Iran. His recent piece for the London Review of Books is titled The Dry and the Wet Burn Together. He joins us now from Edinburgh. We're also joined by Naghmeh Sorabi, a professor of Middle East history at Brandeis University. Earlier this year, she began translating articles from Persian to English by writers inside the country. Her recent piece for the Boston Review is titled The Catastrophe That Has Befallen All of Us. She joins us from Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Welcome to both guests to Democracy Now! I'd like to begin with Professor Sadeghi Bouroujerdi. If you could just respond to this 10-point ceasefire plan, whether you think it's likely to endure, and especially this point of contention about whether it includes a ceasefire regarding Israel's incursions and attacks on Lebanon.
Thank you so much. So, no, I definitely think the fact that we've moved from President Trump's threats to, in essence, destroy an entire civilization to a ceasefire does kind of highlight the fundamental sort of strategic incoherence at the heart of this sort of illegal war of aggression. So I think, we should sort of breathe a sigh of relief. It is a very, very important reprieve, but it is, of course, extremely precarious. It isn't a resolution to this conflict. There's no doubt about that. And it is extremely, extremely precarious. And we're already seeing, it being imperiled as we speak, with sort of ongoing attacks in Lebanon, as well as reports of attacks in the Persian Gulf, as well, which are happening right now. So it is very, very precarious. But obviously both parties, at least for the moment, do have very much strong incentives to continue actually to try and actually prop this up, as do obviously many regional states. I do think it is interesting that President Trump actually didn't mention in his very first in his tweet announcing the ceasefire that Iran's sort of missile arsenal, as well as its nuclear program, these weren't actually mentioned so much. And these obviously were the chief reasons for starting this war, which obviously was also framed as a war of regime change, of course. And also the other thing I would like to note is that, the fact that actually President Trump did acknowledge that the 10-point plan, Iran's 10-point plan, was in essence the framework in which these, or the basis in which these discussions would take place, is also very important, because this would have been dismissed as absolutely fanciful before this conflict, and very much shows that we're now in a situation very much of the Trump administration's own making, namely that the Strait of Hormuz is very much under Iranian control. And there are even sort of reports coming out right now as well that while Iran obviously will facilitate transit through the strait, it is actually going to be dependent on coordination with Iranian authorities and with the Revolutionary Guard. So just to finish, I mean, on this note, I would say that while the ceasefire is precarious, the idea that if conflicts resumes, that this will result in a fundamental sort of change in the balance of power, it actually won't. It's actually hard to imagine that we won't end up exactly where we are now, and basically another ceasefire would have to actually take place as well. So I would say that this is a real strategic blunder for the Trump administration, farcical, as the current head of the CIA actually noted in the actual planning which led up to this illegal war. So I actually do think we are going to have to. It is going to be very precarious, but I do think we've seen a fundamental change in the region, which is very, very, very significant.
And if I could, you mentioned earlier the question of incentives, the incentives for all parties to reach a ceasefire. However, as you said, tentative and precarious it remains. I mean, if you could talk about the scale of the destruction in Iran of civilian infrastructure, one of Iran's largest pharmaceutical manufacturers, bridges, steel industries, etc. The pharmaceutical manufacturer Tawir Daru, which produced critical cancer treatments, if you could comment on that. And how is one to interpret the significance of the systematic attacks on Iran's industrial base, as well as its educational facilities like Sharif University, which was considered and widely referred to as the MIT of the Middle East?
Well, yeah, I think it's very much an extension of what we have seen previously, very much the Israeli modus operandi. So namely sort of the Dahir doctrine initially, and then maybe we can call it the Gaza doctrine. But, Israeli decision makers and President Netanyahu have been very, very clear that their objective is to destroy and sort of, in essence, deindustrialize Iran. So it basically won't be a functioning nation state. That sort of the various gains and achievements of development that had actually been secured over decades and decades through the blood, sweat and tears of Iranian engineers, planners, and various others are to be reversed, basically. And really what they want to see is a form of economic collapse. So we should also note sort of the attacks on Khuzestan steel, also major sort of steel plants in Esfahan. As you mentioned, so the attack on Marshad petrochemical complex, which employs thousands and thousands of people. So yeah, it is an all-out assault on Iran's industrial base, on its sovereignty, very much a clear attempt to de-develop the country. And we also see very much sort of a continuation of scholasticide that we also saw in the case of Gaza and Lebanon. I mean, this is really, really clear. Attacks on some 30 universities, assassinations of faculty, the death of various university students, 600 schools have been hit, and also just a broader attack on Iran's culture, 120 cultural sites. So it really is an all-out assault, an all-out attack on Iranian development, sovereign development, on Iranian sort of cultural heritage, and on sort of its economy more broadly, because I mean, I guess we're assuming that they've realized that actually the sort of, I guess, this plan to prosecute a war of regime change has, in essence, failed. So really what they're hoping is when the hostilities do finally cease, what we'll see is sort of economic failure, basically, and collapse of some sort. So I think that's really has been the ambition, and that's the ongoing reason. That's the sort of the ambition of the Israelis, absolutely. Which, again, I mean, I think quite cynically, they were always pursuing sort of this maneuver to basically try to engender conditions of civil conflict, dissolution, etc.
Well, I'd like to bring in Professor Naghmeh Sorabi. As we mentioned earlier, you've been translating writers from inside Tehran starting earlier this year when protests, in fact, were occurring, widespread protests were occurring in Iran, which were subsequently cited as one of the many justifications that the Trump administration gave for its invasion. If you could tell us some of what you've been hearing from people inside Iran, what people are writing about, the diaries they've been sharing with you, about what conditions in Tehran have been like since these attacks began 40 days ago now.
Yeah, there's a wide range of reactions. Mostly, there's a lot of discussion in Iran about this question of istisal, which means desperation. It just very basically means desperation, but it really contains a sense of people trying hard, trying over and over again to claw rights, to improve their situation. And at every turn, they felt that they were crushed, they were repressed. The war is one of the many ways in which this hope to have a better life and to come out of this istisal had actually affected it and took it away. And so there's been a lot of discussion among the people that I read, people I translate, and people I'm in touch with about how we can think about istisal in the context of the war, but mostly how can we think about it once we come out of this war. When I say there's a wide range of thought, I think it's really important for us to remember that inside Iran, in some ways you can think there are three groups of people, just in a very, very simple way. There's one that was against the war before the war started, was against the war as it was happening, and is very happy and has a sigh of relief now that the ceasefire has happened, even if it doesn't take hold. There's one group that was pro the Islamic Republic, and in some weird ways they are pro-war, if we think about it, because they think this war is strengthening the Islamic Republic, which it has. They think this war is showing that the Islamic Republic is stable and is going to persist despite anti-imperialist, as they put it within their own rhetoric, despite imperialist powers having designs on Iran. And then there's a third category of everyday normal people who were for this war because they saw that this war is going to be the only way for them to come out of istisal. For a lot of the people that I'm in touch with, including this morning when I spoke to them, the question is how to bring society back together if they're going to come out of this situation, and mostly how to deal with the pro-war people who saw being pro-war as a way of coming out of this desperate situation. And I think it's really important to keep this in mind, because one of the ways in which we have ended up where we are today is that instead of understanding Iran for what it is, we keep imposing wishful thinking upon it. We want it to be unstable, the system. We want the people to all be united, let's say, against the war. And it's not. And the voices inside Iran know that, and they're contending with that and trying to come up with solutions for a future that includes all of these groups of people.
And Professor Sorabi, I'd like to ask about some specific issues brought up by the writers you've been translating, specifically with respect to economic conditions inside the country, with some estimates suggesting that about 40% of Iran's population is now below the poverty line. Even middle-class people, like one of those whose work you have translated, have reported the spiraling cost of living in Iran. This woman in particular saying that her landlord has raised the rent by 30% for next year, though she may lose up to 40% of her income because of the war. Right. If you could talk about this.
Yeah, she's a very good example, but one of actually the more privileged people that I read and I've translated. So let's just start with, by one estimate, last year, 30% of the population was under the poverty line. As you mentioned, the estimate currently is that 40% are just in this basically 40 days. We don't know what the actual numbers are going to be. We have to wait for the dust to settle to see what that percentage actually is. By one account, the price of goods, just everyday food items, has more than doubled in the 40 days. People have been laid off of jobs, not because of any kind of, I don't know, restructuring, but when you hit these supposed military targets, none of them are actually, some of them are military targets, some of them are within a complex. They employ, let's say, 20,000 households. When that factory or that complex goes away, these 20,000 households are also now going to not have any jobs. So people are losing their jobs, people are losing their homes, food prices are going up. And that is also partly what, for example, the one that you mentioned, but something that I translated about 2 days ago by a woman named Zahra, where she talks about them being bombed. The bomb falls near their house. She loses her hearing. And then there's just one line in there, and she says, "I lost my job today." And there's nothing more in that, because nothing needs to be more said in that. And the question is, again, even if the ceasefire holds, how they're going to pull this country out of the situation, considering the fact that the protests that started in December were economic protests initially. They become political protests by January. But this istisal that I already talked about, at its heart, at its root, is also an economic question. And the war has just made it worse. And people's testimonies about that just prove that it has.
Professor Sadeghi Bouroujerdi, if you could comment on one of the points that Professor Sorabi raised, which has been the subject of some discussion and controversy, namely what has happened as a result of the assassination of so many of Iran's top leaders. You wrote in a recent piece, quote, "The decapitation of the leadership has not produced capitulation." That, of course, is clear. And you say, if anything, it has arguably accelerated the consolidation of power in the hands of a younger and more militant generation within the political and security elite. So if you could elaborate on that and what precisely this more hardline and militant position may mean for the future of Iran's relations with the U.S. and also its Gulf neighbors.
Yes, I think it might be useful to sort of actually connect that to something that Professor Sohrabi was also saying. So, I mean, I also study the impact of sanctions on Iran, and particularly we see since 2012, actually, when the Obama administration actually pursued so-called crippling sanctions and really sort of tried to shut Iran out of the global financial system, we have seen this steady growth and sort of immiseration of the Iranian populace, particularly obviously the working classes and lower middle classes. And this hasn't been linear. It has been relatively kind of uneven because the Iranian government has taken various measures to diminish that somewhat. But what we've seen is actually it has empowered those connected to the security apparatus and architecture within the state. It's what I use the term asymmetric statehood. So basically, we see those elements that have access to black markets, smuggling, and so on, have actually proven resilient, actually. And this is kind of a story which could characterize the Islamic Republic and the Iranian Revolution since 1979, the Iranian state, really. So we have obviously the baptism of fire in the form of the Iran-Iraq War. But then really, I mean, the Islamic Republic and Iran more broadly has always been facing, real sort of, I guess, imperial aggression, economic warfare, as well as actually outright warfare since its inception. And therefore, it has developed a significant resilience and has institutionalized that revolution as it ultimately was articulated and cashed out. So, yeah, the idea that if you just sort of decapitate the supreme leader or you decapitate leading figures in the Revolutionary Guard, we're talking about a major institution, and the state more broadly. I mean, just beyond the Revolutionary Guards. I mean, there are a plurality of power centers within the Iranian state, which, power can be, is concentrated obviously in these, but it also is relatively diffuse, even within the Revolutionary Guards. So just take, for instance, when we had the assassination again of leading military personnel on the 28th of February, Iran very quickly activated what's come to be known as its mosaic defense strategy, whereby you have this sort of decentralized command, which has been built over a significant period of time, whereby operations can continue even in the event of senior commanders being assassinated. And really, of course, this speaks to a broader strategy, a broader strategic horizon of, Iran in conventional terms, under arms embargoes and sanctions, etc. I mean, it never was under the misapprehension that it could compete with the United States in conventional military terms. So it always has pursued this asymmetric and attritional strategy. And of course, I mean, this comes at a heavy cost for the country, for the population at large, and also even for the leadership. I mean, we've seen they've been hit very badly. But I guess the philosophy there is that they can actually withstand that because it obviously is an existential fight. They are prepared to weather and absorb that pain. And they kind of understand that the United States will come in like a bull in a china shop, basically unleash huge amounts of destruction, but ultimately it'll be forced to withdraw because there simply isn't the appetite for a long, drawn-out campaign. And as I said, that's extremely costly for Iran. But I mean, this is actually how they intend to weather the storm, and they don't really see that they have another option.
Well, let's step back and talk about one of the questions that you've raised in the several articles that you've written. You wrote in a London Review of Books article last month, we are witnessing the realization of a long-cherished ambition, a neoconservative fever dream that Benjamin Netanyahu has lobbied for in one form or another for decades. And in an article that you cited a quote from, the one by the CIA director calling Israel's, concluding that regime change would occur in Iran, him calling it farcical. The New York Times, which reported this in a piece headlined How Trump Took the U.S. to War with Iran, it reported that Netanyahu, in his visit to the White House on February 11th, held a meeting in the Situation Room with Trump, as well as other senior military officials, including the CIA director, where he was, Netanyahu, accompanied via video call by other Israeli military officials, including the intelligence chief, that is the head of the Mossad. And the Israelis made the case in that meeting for war with Iran, laying out possible scenarios and concluding that victory was all but guaranteed. Now, Netanyahu has, of course, made an unprecedented number of trips to the U.S. since Trump came to power. 7 visits in the last 14 months. That's, of course, on average once every 2 months. So if you could give an assessment of your sense of to what extent this war may have been driven by Israel, and whether Israel's intentions coincided exactly or more or less exactly with the U.S., which is why the U.S. ultimately went along with Israel.
Well, I think, there has, we have to look at the structural context. I mean, really since the Carter administration and the Iranian Revolution, we have seen this ongoing massive militarization of the Persian Gulf region. I mean, just this proliferation of US bases throughout various Persian Gulf states, actually states in the Persian Gulf, sort of tells you the degree to which the region has been militarized. And a lot of this was actually to contain both Iran and then, previously Iraq. We obviously have the really atrocious legacy of the Iraq War, which again was very much a sort of a war of regime change to very much transform the region in the image of the United States and Israel. And I think these were driven obviously by American imperial imperatives. I mean, the fact that there are all these sort of American military assets in the region. Of course, Israel is set to benefit, obviously, and it has been the beneficiary, really. And what I think really what we're seeing, obviously, since October 7th, is that basically all guardrails have been removed, and we see very much kind of an alignment between the United States and the Israeli state in order to really conclusively enshrine Israeli domination of the entire region, where it has complete freedom of action to carry out genocide, ethnic cleansing, attacks on Lebanon, southern Lebanon, and then pursuing again another sort of campaign of ethnic cleansing there as well in the south, as well as freedom of action in Iran. And Iran is often seen as, is seen as the last, as it were, obstacle to both Israeli and American domination. So I have no doubt that Benjamin Netanyahu did exercise, significant influence in pushing the Trump administration in order to do this. And he is, like as you said, every other month he's visiting Washington. It's really kind of unprecedented. But I guess what we're really seeing is a classic case, very much supported by the Israeli state and advocated by the Israeli state, of U.S. imperial hubris, really, and groupthink, whereby President Trump himself has really surrounded himself with how can I say, sycophants for the most part, who aren't really willing to challenge him on something that he is really obviously committed to. And I think, coming off the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro and obviously the attack on Venezuela, he clearly believed, and he was clearly influenced, and he clearly wanted to believe, and this is why I say groupthink is important. He clearly wanted to believe that this would be similarly straightforward. And you could argue that he thought this because he's basically been, by both sort of the corporate media and Fox News and so on, has been told that he can do this. And previously, obviously, he has done things with minimal consequence. So we can think about the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in January 2020. There wasn't sort of significant repercussions for that. Similarly, when he attacked Iran's nuclear installations, most recently, there wasn't massive fallout over this. And it really is only when sort of the Islamic Republic sensed that there was really an existential threat that it started to move to both horizontal escalation, so attacks on the Gulf states and their sort of crucial energy infrastructure, as well as closing the Strait of Hormuz. If we believe the reporting in the New York Times, and of course we should take that with a pinch of salt, there clearly was the impression that this would be a cakewalk. And this wasn't simply just this was being sold by the Israelis, which of course it was. And there might be even somewhat of divergence there. So maybe the Israelis did actually believe that this would lead to regime change and the installation of the former Shah's son and so on. Or they tried to at least market that. But it seems that the Trump administration, or President Trump himself, wasn't particularly enamored of that. But he did think that he could provoke regime collapse and basically maybe do some sort of deal with the remnants of the Islamic Republic. So I wouldn't say that we shouldn't entirely conflate them, and we should look at the longer arc of sort of American imperialism in the region. But yes, of course, Israel does play. I think the specific decision to take this action was obviously very much significantly influenced by Benjamin Netanyahu in particular, who, has been. He's been basically portraying Iran as the ultimate bogeyman of the region for decades and decades, and he has been lobbying for this his entire career.
So just before we wrap, Professor Sorabi, if you could tell us, just to go back to the situation inside Iran, number one, the question of communications, how people in the country are communicating with one another and with those outside. Net blocks, the Global Monitor reported Sunday that the state-imposed near total internet shutdown is now the longest nationwide blackout on record in history, and also the reports of an increasing number of executions within Iran. We have about a minute.
Yeah, so basically, as you said, on February 28th, the Iranian government shut down modes of communication. Basically, you can't call into the country. It's very, very hard to. People can buy little packets of phone cards where they can call out, and that's unstable. Internet, basically, there's something called the national internet inside Iran, so they have their own apps. They can communicate within that, but that is actually monitored, so everybody is very careful about what they say, but they can't get out with it. It's very, very hard to. Again, going back to the economic situation, talking about black markets, which Professor Sadeghi also mentioned, a black market of proxy configurations has developed. These are very, very expensive, but they allow you to break through the internet blockage that you mentioned, but it costs a lot of money. So in a circumstance in which we're talking about the unequalness of the economic disparity within Iran is now showing itself in terms of who gets to connect with the outside world and who can't. In terms of the execution, it's really important to remember when we talk about how the region, how Iran has changed and how it has withstood imperial forces. One of the ways in which it's done that is that it's actually doubled down on its internal repression. It has been executing protesters that it arrested in January. It has continued to arrest people despite war conditions for a variety of reasons. And it's really important to remember that while the Islamic Republic before the war was not okay with protesters, it had a language in which it distinguished between protest and rioting. What the war has done is that it's allowed this now empowered state to turn protests, all of it, into fifth columns. And it's going to now, and they have announced it, they talked about it, the head of the judiciary 2 days ago, that they're going to continue executing people and they're going to continue confiscating their property in the name of, now it's treason. So you have a new word for it. It was protest, rioting, and now trying to claw some space out of this world that Iranians live in is now going to be called treason and dealt with accordingly.
Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Naghmeh Sorabi, Professor of Middle East History at Brandeis University, and Professor Eskander Sadeghi Burujerdi, Assistant Professor of International Relations of the Middle East at the University of St. Andrews.
Thanks for watching Democracy Now! On YouTube. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to make sure you never miss a video. And for more of our audience-supported journalism, go to democracynow.org, where you can download our news app, sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the daily podcast, and so much more.